The monastery had been sealed for 50 years, not locked, not simply closed. Sealed, the way a wound is closed over and forgotten, the way a name is removed from a ledger and never spoken aloud again. The great wooden gates were bound with iron chain, and the chain had rusted through 2 seasons of monsoon and 48 winters of cold, until the rust itself had become part of the gate, until the iron and the wood had fused into something that felt almost sacred. A warning, a silence, a boundary that the valley had agreed, without speaking, never to question. The village of Tharchin sat below the monastery on a dry hillside, and the people there had grown accustomed to looking up at those closed gates the same way one grows accustomed to a scar. It is there. It has always been there. It is simply part of how the face looks now. Monk Palden arrived in Tharchin on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, when the high passes were still clear, and the wind from the northern ridgeline carried the first suggestion of the cold that was coming. He was 67 years old. His robe was the dark saffron of old apricots, worn thin at both elbows, and his sandals were practical leather ones that had walked more mountain roads than he could any longer remember. He carried one bag. In the bag was a change of robe, a small wrapped bundle of dried food, a tin cup, and a notebook 3/4 full of observations recorded across 40 years of monastic work. He had not intended to stop in Tharchin. He was traveling between the monastery of Lingsang, where he had spent the previous 3 years as an assistant librarian, and the monastery of Keru further north, where an aging abbot had requested help cataloging old texts. It was the kind of work most monks did not want, slow, careful, requiring patience with damaged manuscripts and faded ink, and Palden had developed a reputation for it over the decades. The road through Tharchin was simply the most direct route north. He had not intended to look up at the sealed gates at all, but he stopped at the edge of the village to fill his tin cup from a small stone channel of mountain water, and while he was stopped, an old woman sitting outside the nearest house looked at him with the careful attention that villagers in remote places develop for strangers, and she said, in the matter-of-fact way of someone observing weather, "You are from a monastery." "Yes," Palden said. "Then you will want to look at Chaling." She nodded up the hillside to where the monastery's walls rose above the hill's shoulder. "Why was it closed?" he asked. "Nobody knows," the woman said. "Or nobody says. It comes to the same thing after a while." Palden filled his cup. He drank the water slowly. He looked at the gates for a long moment. Then he picked up his bag and asked if there was a place in the village where he might sleep that night. He told himself he was simply tired, but it was more than that, and he knew it. He had spent enough years among old texts and forgotten records to recognize the specific quality of a concealed thing. Monasteries did not seal their gates on a whim. Something had happened at Choiling. Something had required not simply closure but concealment, not the honest closing of a monastery that had run out of resources or monks, but the deliberate, sustained, iron-chained silence of a place that someone had decided must not be examined. The question was what? The village headman, a heavy-set man named Tenzin Dorje, gave him a room without charging anything, in the way that mountain villages had always housed traveling monks. That evening, after the meal, Palden said quietly, "The monastery above, Choiling. Tell me about it." Tenzin Dorje looked at the butter lamp on the table for a moment. "There is not much to tell. It was closed before I was born. My father was a boy when they sealed it. He said the abbot locked the gates one morning and never opened them again." "What was the abbot's name?" "Jampa Norbu. He died a few years after, in the village. An old man by then. He never explained." The headman paused. "My father said there were about 30 monks at Choiling when it was closed. He said they left over the course of a few days, 1 or 2 at a time, quietly, like water disappearing from a pot." "Was there a scandal?" Tenzin shook his head. "People said many things, a wrongdoing, a vision, a dispute with the regional authorities, but nobody ever knew. After enough time passed, people stopped asking. It became the way things were." Palden nodded and said nothing more, but he sat long after the headman had gone to bed in the small quiet room with his notebook open and wrote 3 words at the top of a new page: "Why seal it?" In the morning he walked up the hill. The path to Cheeling was still visible, barely, beneath decades of dry grass and loose stone. Someone had maintained it once. The stones were deliberately placed, the slope deliberately managed, and then the maintenance had stopped, and the mountain had begun, with its usual patience, to reclaim the ground. Paulden walked slowly. The altitude was significant, and his knees registered the incline in a way they would not have 20 years earlier. He stopped twice to rest and to look out over the valley. The village of Tharchin scattered along the hillside, the terraced fields brown with autumn, the thin thread of the road winding south through the dry valley, and beyond it all the enormous pale face of the mountain to the north, so large it seemed less like a mountain than like a wall. He reached the monastery gate just before mid-morning. Up close, the wooden gate was impressive construction, thick planks of mountain timber, iron-banded, set into a stone arch built to last centuries. The chain that bound it was rusted deep brown, and the padlock at its center was seized solid. But the gates themselves were in remarkable condition. Even after 50 years of exposure, the wood had not rotted through. Someone had built this to endure. He walked the perimeter wall. On the eastern side, he found a section where fallen stone had created a natural step. He climbed over and stood inside the monastery compound for the first time. The silence inside was different from the silence outside. Outside there was wind, distant birds, the faint sounds of the village below, a dog, a voice, something being carried. Inside the compound walls, those sounds became remote, muted. The compound had a quality of enclosure that went beyond the physical walls. It felt as though the air inside had not moved in a very long time. He looked. The compound contained several structures. The main temple building occupied the center, a two-story structure of stone and timber, its roof partially collapsed on the eastern end, the rest apparently intact. Around it stood smaller buildings, monks' quarters, a kitchen, a storage house, all closed, all showing the specific deterioration of abandonment rather than destruction. There was no evidence of fire, no evidence of violence. The buildings had simply been left, and time had worked on them in the slow and thorough way time works on everything that is not tended. He began with the main temple. The door was not locked. It was not even properly closed. It stood an inch ajar, the wood warped over decades until the latch no longer caught. Paulden pushed it open and stood in the doorway while his eyes adjusted. What he saw made him stand very still. The temple had not been emptied. In every monastery he had seen that was properly closed and abandoned, the valuable objects were removed first. The statues, the thankas, the ritual implements, the texts, these things were taken away before a community dispersed. They were too important, too sacred, too significant to be left. An empty temple was the normal consequence of a closed monastery. But Choling's temple was not empty. The altar still held its statues. Dust-covered, yes, the silk offerings long since faded to a uniform gray. But the statues were there. A large central Buddha figure flanked by two bodhisattvas, all bronze, all apparently intact. The butter lampstand still stood before the altar, the lamps themselves long dry. The Thangka paintings still hung on the walls, their images indistinct under the settled dust but still present. And on the shelves that lined the left wall, the shelves that in a functioning monastery would hold the community's texts, there were rows of wrapped bundles, text bundles, still wrapped in yellow cloth, still tied with traditional cords, dozens of them, perhaps more than 100. The monastery's texts had not been removed. Paulden walked to the shelves and stood before them for a long time. He did not touch anything yet. He simply looked. A monastery did not leave its texts behind, not unless the departure was sudden, a flood, a fire, something requiring immediate flight. But the conditions here spoke against any such emergency. The objects were arranged, the temple was orderly. This had been a deliberate departure. Deliberate, and yet nothing had been removed. Why? He took out his notebook and wrote, "Texts remain, objects remain." Deliberate departure, but nothing removed. The monastery was sealed, not emptied. Was this the point? He moved to the shelves and with great care lifted one of the wrapped bundles. Inside, a wooden-covered manuscript in the traditional long rectangular format. He opened it carefully, a standard liturgical text, prayers, ritual sequences. He rewrapped it and returned it to the shelf. He tried a second bundle, then a third, both liturgical. But in the fourth bundle, between the boards of an apparently routine collection of daily prayers, he found something that was not a liturgical text at all. It was a ledger, a simple accounting ledger of the kind used in monasteries across the region to record practical matters. This one was filled from cover to cover with handwriting, small, careful handwriting in rows. Each row contained a name. After the name, a date. After the date, what appeared to be a place of origin. And after that, a small symbol he did not immediately recognize. He sat down on the floor, in the dust, with the ledger on his knees. There were hundreds of names. He turned through the pages slowly. The dates ranged across approximately 4 years, beginning in a year that Paulden, calculating backward, placed in the early 1960s. The names were a mixture, Tibetan names, mostly, but also some from other communities of the high plateau, from regions that had seen considerable turbulence in that particular decade. The places of origin were similarly diverse, villages, valleys, and districts that he recognized as belonging to areas that had experienced significant upheaval in the years following 1959. He was beginning to understand. He turned to the back of the ledger, where the handwriting changed. These final pages were notes in a different and older hand, more formal, more careful, the handwriting of someone trained in classical calligraphic traditions. He read slowly, his lips moving occasionally over difficult passages, and as he read, the silence of the sealed monastery settled around him like something physical. The notes were written by Jampa Norbu. The name appeared several times, always in the third person, as though the abbot had written about himself from the outside, creating a record that would remain legible even if the name were removed from it. But he had not removed it. He had written it clearly, as though this were a document intended to be found, as though the finding were the whole point. Paulden read, "Between 1959 and 1963, the monastery of Choling had received refugees, not officially, not with any kind of formal permission. The abbot, alone or nearly alone in his decision, had opened the monastery's back entrance, a small door in the northern wall that the ledger referred to simply as the second gate, to families and individuals fleeing across the high passes from the north. He had housed them in the monks' quarters. He had fed them from the monastery's stores. He had, when necessary, helped them continue south toward the lower valleys and eventually the roads that led toward India. The monastery had become a transit point, a hidden one. And the ledger was the record. Every name was a person who had passed through Choling. Every date was the date of arrival. Every place of origin was where they had come from. And the small symbol, Paulden returned to the inside cover and found a brief key in the abbot's handwriting, meant the person had left safely, had continued south, had survived the passage. Nearly every entry carried the symbol. Paulden sat in the dust of the silent temple for a very long time. He thought about the decision the abbot must have faced. Harboring refugees in that period was not simply risky. It was potentially catastrophic for the monastery, for the monks, for the abbot himself. If discovered, the community could have been destroyed entirely. The abbot had known this. He had done it anyway, for 4 years, systematically and carefully, keeping a record of every person who passed through. And when it was over, when the flow of refugees slowed and the risk of discovery had grown too great, he had made a second decision. He had sealed the monastery, not to hide shame, not because of any scandal or failure. He had left everything in place, the texts, the objects, the ledger hidden among the liturgical books, and he had sealed the gates and never opened them again, and he had died a few years later without explaining to anyone why. Because explaining would have required admitting what the monastery had done. And admitting that, in the climate of those years, could still have brought consequences. For the dispersed monks, for the families who had passed through, for anyone whose name appeared in that ledger. He had sealed the monastery to protect what was inside it. Paulden understood this with a certainty that had nothing to do with inference. He understood it the way one understands something one has always, at some level, already known. He had been a monk for 45 years, lived in institutions shaped by the same traditions, the same pressures, the same awareness of what could be done quietly that could not be done openly. He recognized the shape of this decision the way he might recognize the handwriting of a teacher he had not seen in decades. Jampa Norbu had not been hiding a failure. He had been protecting a gift. Paulden turned to the last pages of the notes. The writing here was different, less formal, more uneven, as though written in age or illness. The abbot had written that he did not know whether the record would ever be found. He hoped it would be found by someone who understood what it was. He listed the names of several monks who had been part of the effort, perhaps 5 or 6 who had known and kept the secret, and noted they had been instructed to carry the secret with them when they dispersed, not as a burden, but as a protection. As long as nobody confirmed the story, nobody could be harmed by it. And then, near the very end, a paragraph that Paulden read 3 times. The abbot had written that there were 412 names in the ledger. He had counted them himself at the end. He had written that number down, and then he had written, "I do not know how many became families. I do not know how many had children who do not know this story. I am not able to know what these names became. But they are here, and they are true, and I leave them for whoever finds this, in the hope that the names can someday be restored to the people they belong to." 412 names. 412 people who had passed through this hidden place in those years and survived. Their passage recorded carefully and then sealed away in a locked monastery on a dry hillside, tended by rust and silence, and the faithfulness of an old abbot who had understood that a record was not useful until it could be read safely. Paulden sat in the dust for a long time. Outside, he could hear the wind. Through the gaps in the collapsed roof, the light had changed, the morning brightness softening toward the flatter light of early afternoon. He had been sitting here longer than he realized. He thought about what the old woman had said the previous morning. Nobody knows, or nobody says. It comes to the same thing, after a while, but it had not come to the same thing. That was precisely the point. The abbot had understood that not saying and not knowing were not the same thing at all, and he had spent the last years of his life ensuring that one day they would be separated again, that the knowing would survive the not saying and emerge on the other side of it intact. He closed the ledger carefully. He rewrapped it in its yellow cloth. He held it on his knee for a moment, feeling its weight. A thin thing, really, a modest accounting ledger, and then he placed it gently in his bag. He rose from the floor slowly, his knees protesting the cold stone. He walked to the temple door and stood looking out at the compound, the silent buildings, the fallen and still standing walls, the sky above it all, which was deep blue and very clear. He walked to the northern wall and found, after some searching, the second gate the abbot had written about. It was smaller than the main gate. Its chain and lock were rusted through like the front, but the gate itself was different, newer timber, more recently built. And on the inside of the frame, barely visible beneath the accumulated dust, someone had carved a series of small marks. Tally marks. 4 and 1, 4 and 1. Again and again, in groups of 5, he counted them. There were 82 groups, 410 marks with 2 individual marks beside the last group. 412. The abbot, or someone helping him, had kept the count there too, on the gate through which they had passed, as though the gate itself should know what had gone through it. Paulden stood with his hand against the carved marks for a long time. He was not a sentimental man. He had lived long enough to know that sentiment and emotion were different things, that one could feel something deeply without drowning in it, that grief and gratitude could occupy the same moment without either destroying the other. He felt both now. He felt the weight of what the abbot had done, the sustained courage of it, the loneliness of it, the faith involved in sealing a door and trusting that the right person would eventually find what was behind it. He left the compound the way he had entered, through the section of fallen wall on the eastern side. He walked down the hill in the late afternoon, and he went directly to the headman's house and sat across from Tenzin Dorji and said, "I need to tell you what is in your monastery." The headman listened without interrupting. He was the kind of man who had learned, in the way of people who hold responsibility in small places, to listen to a great deal before speaking. When Palden finished, Tenzin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, 412. Yes, Palden said. The headman was quiet again. Then, carefully, my grandfather's name. He always said he had come south through a monastery. He never said which one. He said the monks fed him. He said nothing more than that. He stopped. He died before I was old enough to ask the right questions. Palden opened his bag and took out the ledger and set it on the table between them. He said, perhaps his name is here. The headman looked at the ledger without touching it for a long moment. Then he looked up at Palden, and his expression was the expression of someone encountering, late in life, a piece of information that reorganizes everything they thought they knew about their own history. Palden had seen that expression before, in the faces of people who discovered old letters, old records, old photographs that connected the present to a past that had seemed irretrievable. He said quietly, it will take time. There is much work to do. Scholars, archivists, organizations that maintain records from that period. It cannot be done quickly and it cannot be done alone. He paused. But it can be done. The record is intact. The names are here. He stayed in Tharchin for 4 more days. He made a complete inventory of the temple's contents, the texts on the shelves, the objects on the altar, the condition of the structures. He drew careful diagrams in his notebook. He wrote a letter to a scholar at the monastery of Lingsang who specialized in records of refugee movements from that period. He wrote a second letter to a historian in the south whom he had met years before at a conference of archivists. On his last morning, he walked up the hill one final time. He stood before the main gate. The chain was still there. He had not broken it, had not removed it. The gate was still sealed in the technical sense. The lock was still rusted through. But he had entered and exited through the section of fallen wall on the eastern side, and he had left that section unblocked so that others could enter when the time came. He thought about Jampa Norbu, who had made a decision in a difficult time and spent the remaining years of his life maintaining the silence that the decision required, and who had died in this village without knowing whether the record would be found or whether finding it would matter. He thought about the particular kind of faith involved in doing something important and then releasing it completely, in sealing the gate and trusting whatever came after trust to do the rest. He thought, too, about something more personal. His grandfather had come south as a young man, through the mountains, in circumstances the family had never spoken of clearly. The dates aligned. The route was plausible. He had not permitted himself to search for a specific name in the ledger. That was not the work, and he knew it. The work was to ensure the record reached people who could do with it what he could not. Verify it, protect it, make it available to everyone whose name or ancestor's name was there. But he could not help knowing that it was possible. He turned away from the gate. The valley below was bright in the morning sun. The terraced fields and the stone houses of Tharchin laid out on the hillside in the old way of mountain villages, each building placed where placing made sense, without plan but with deep accumulated logic. The road north wound up behind the monastery and disappeared over a ridge. He put on his bag. He looked at the gate one more time. Then he began to walk. He did not know whether all the names would be found, or what finding them would mean to the families who might be reached. He did not know whether the monastery would eventually be restored, or simply documented and understood at last. He did not know what the headman would discover when he searched for his grandfather's name. He knew the ledger was intact. He knew the record was real. He knew that 412 people had passed through a small door in a mountain monastery during the most difficult years of their lives, and that someone had thought their passage important enough to write down, important enough to protect, important enough to leave sealed in stone and iron until the day someone came to look. He walked north into the long, dry valley. The wind was behind him. The sky was the high, clear blue of altitude, the kind that exists only at a certain elevation, sharp and depthless at the same time. Somewhere above him, beyond the ridge he was climbing toward, the mountain that had stood watch over this valley for 1,000 years was still there, indifferent and enormous and permanent in the way that mountains are permanent, while everything below them changes and passes and is forgotten. he walked. And behind him, on the hillside, the sealed gate stood open to the light for the first time in 50 years. Not literally, not yet, but open in the way that matters. The knowing had finally separated from the not saying, and what had been preserved in silence was now beginning, slowly and carefully, to find its way back into the world where it had always belonged.